could be admitted to penance without previous deposition from his office. The general principle which Augustine laid down, that secret sins might be confessed secretly, while open sins must be confessed openly, was probably largely adopted by bishops in their penitential discipline. Leo the Great, however, condemned in vigorous language the conduct of those bishops who compelled penitents to read aloud in the church a complete list of their sins, holding that it was sufficient for the relief of the conscience if men confessed their sin to the priests alone, and that this course was also desirable for the avoiding of scandal. From this time, probably, public confession of sin became rare. Almsgiving, or bequests to the church, also came to be recognized as a means of atoning for sin. "If thou hast money," says St. Ambrose, "buy off thy sin. The Lord is not for sale, venalis, but thou thyself art for sale. Buy thyself off by thy works. Buy thyself off by thy money. Vile is money, but precious is mercy." Salvian insists that the only thing which a man can do on his deathbed for the good of his soul is to leave all his goods to the church. But the offering must be accompanied by real contrition of heart in order to be efficacious. Men like St. Augustine warned their flocks against leaving money to the church in a fit of anger against their natural heirs, but still the practice grew of making the church the legatee of at least a portion of a man's worldly goods. And not only did the dying leave their goods to the church, offerings were also made for the departed. "It cannot be denied," says St. Augustine, "that the souls of the departed are comforted by the piety of their surviving friends when the mediatorial sacrifice is offered for them and alms are given on their behalf in the church. But these things only profit those who so live as to deserve to be benefited by them." As few would believe that their friends had lived so ill as to receive no benefit from their offerings, or so well as not to require them, the effect of this principle was that offerings were made for almost all the departed. The Christian Church brought comfort to an age in the throes of dissolution. Before a generation which had fallen into moral laxity, it held up a standard of nobler and purer life. It handed on to the New World which arose on the ruins of the Western Empire the torch of truth which it had received from above. It diffused through society a more tender feeling for the weak and suffering, and so in the end introduced a more humane spirit into general legislation and popular customs. The gladiatorial shows which had delighted the Romans were forbidden indeed by Constantine, but they were not really put down until the noble self-sacrifice of the monk Telemachus produced so deep an impression that the rescript against the practice, which Honorius issued immediately afterwards, really brought it to an end. Attempts were made to restrain scenical representations within the bounds of decency and good order. The wretched lot of slaves and captives was mitigated. The almost unlimited power which the old Roman law gave to a father over his children was restricted. Above all, the condition of women was changed, and the same chastity was looked for in men which had once been expected only from women. The laws which inflicted disabilities on the unmarried were repealed, and celibates placed on an equality with the married, while difficulties were placed in the way of second marriages. With regard to divorce, a discrepancy arose between the law of the empire and the law of the church, which had never recognized any ground for divorce except adultery. The great freedom of separation which prevailed in pagan times was indeed restrained, but the civil law permitted many divorces which the church did not sanction, and from this permission scandals arose. "Hear ye now," cries a preacher at the end of the 4th century, "ye that change your wives as readily as your cloaks, ye that so often and so easily build bridal chambers, ye that on a small provocation write a bill of divorcement, ye that leave many widows while ye still live, be ye fully assured that marriage is dissolved only by death and by adultery." Jerome also bewails the difference of the laws. "The laws of Caesar," he says, "differ from those of Christ. Papinian, the great jurist, lays down one thing, Paul a different thing." The duty of beneficence, whether to ascetics or to others who were in need, came into prominence in the Church and produced great results. The Church, become rich through the privileges bestowed upon it, was the principal protector of the poor and helpless in the needful time of trouble. The bishops had generally the chief control of ecclesiastical funds, and they were rarely found wanting in their due administration. In large cities, the lists of those who were supported or succoured by the alms of churchmen often included some thousands of names. Rome was divided, for the purpose of poor relief, into 7 regions, each under the care of a deacon, and in each region a special edifice was built for his use in distributing relief. When St. Chrysostom was at Antioch, 3,000 names were on the list of those who depended on the church for daily bread, and in Constantinople the same excellent prelate fed 7,000. Special institutions were developed for the care of the stranger, the sick, the helpless of every kind. The great hospital which St. Basil founded at Caesarea was no doubt a model for many others. Similar hospitals were soon erected in many cities both of the East and the West. The well-known friends of Jerome, Fabiola, and Pamachius founded hospitals in Rome and in neighbouring Portus. Paulinus established one in Nola. Such institutions were maintained either from the common funds of the Church or from special donations of land and money. The income of the Church in its earlier and simpler ages was derived from the offerings of the faithful, but when, under the privilege granted by Christian emperors, the Church itself became possessed of considerable property, these oblations became relatively of less importance. Still, rich offerings were made, especially on saints' days and other high festivals, which were devoted partly to the maintenance of the clergy, partly to the succour of the poor. The bishops, who disposed of great riches, generally lived very simply, though there were no doubt some who justified the sneer of Ammianus Marcellinus, that it was no wonder that men fought for the possession of the see of Rome, seeing the wealth and splendour which they enjoyed who attained it. But while there was in the Church no lack of Christian virtues, evils also appeared which were perhaps inseparable from a time of transition. When Constantine gave his favour to the Church, a multitude pressed into it who were still pagan at heart, taking with them many of the vices and superstitions of heathenism. Constantine seems to have contemplated this bringing over of the common herd from impure motives as one end of his liberality to the Church. Few, he said, were influenced by a real love of truth. He could draw men to the doctrine of salvation more readily by abundant largesse than by preaching. He bestowed honours and privileges upon cities which accepted Christianity. Christian writers did not deny that many entered the Church who were Christian only in name. Eusebius tells us that he had himself observed the injury done by the flocking in of greedy and worthless men who lowered the standard of social life, and by the dissimulation of those who slunk into the Church with a mere outward show of Christianity. Augustine declares that few sought Jesus for Jesus' sake. Most sought their own ends in their profession of the faith. When Christians said these things, it is not wonderful if a pagan declared that many of those who filled the churches were no more Christians than a player king is a king. It was necessary to forbid even men in holy orders to use art magic or incantations, to cast horoscopes or to practice astrology, to make phylacteries or amulets, and to warn all persons against practicing secret idolatry and attending heathen festivals. Nor was the Church altogether free from superstitions of Jewish origin. And the clergy did not in all cases give to the laity an example of the highest Christian life. When office in the Church no longer brought with it trouble and danger, but honour and power, it was eagerly sought for, and that sometimes by unworthy means. Gregory of Nazianzus laments, and Jerome declaims, against the eager pressing of ambitious and self-seeking men into places of honour in the Church, the luxury, the flattery, the legacy hunting, the trading of some unworthy members of the clergy. We must of course bear in mind that the language of Gregory is that of a sensitive man, weary of the strife of tongues and the wiles of intrigue, while Jerome's is that of a bitter and unsparing satirist, himself devoted to the ascetic life. But neither one nor the other is likely to have spoken utterly without warrant, and if confirmation of their words be required, it is unfortunately to be found in a law of the Emperor Leo of the year 469, which forbids men to gain holy orders by bribery, and rebukes the avarice which hung as a cloud over the altar. Far from seeking the sacred office, a man should not accept it unless compelled. We have here the germ of nolo episcopari. Two causes, it is to be feared, tended to demoralize the clergy. One was the excessive prevalence of dogmatic disputes, which sometimes withdrew men's thoughts from the necessity of a holy life. It is easier, and perhaps more profitable, to be a partisan than a saint. The other was, for the East, the imperial court at Constantinople. When the emperor perpetually interfered in affairs of dogma, and it was of the last importance to gain his ear, bishops and priests jostled with courtiers and lackeys, in the anterooms of the palace,